One time he locked me in containers with his shipment of kids. There were kids in there that didn't speak English. There were kids that were sick and that were already dying. There were babies. There were babies that were 6 years old, and I'll never forget them just crying, and everybody was just staring at them. Everybody was just staring at each other. Nobody knew whether or not to move. I was freaked out. There were kids in there from Africa, from Mexico.
I spent over 30 years driving trucks, crossing highways and borders like it was second nature. Back then, the world felt as big as the road ahead, and every trip was a new journey. It wasn't just a job, it was my life. But no matter how far you travel, some things have a way of catching up with you. You think they're behind you, locked away, but they're not. I paid attention to every detail, checking the truck from top to bottom before every trip. Whether it was the tires, the engine, or the trailer, I made sure nothing was out of place. It was an ordinary evening, the kind where nothing much happens. I was sitting on the couch flipping through channels, not really paying attention to anything. That's when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was my old manager. We hadn't spoken since the day I retired. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. His voice was calm, but there was something urgent about the way he spoke. He told me he had a job for me, a delivery, 2 trips. At first I was confused. I reminded him I was retired, but then he mentioned the pay. It wasn't just a lot of money. It was more than I had ever seen in my life. $1 million, half up front, half after the job was done. I nearly dropped the phone. I asked him why he was offering so much for a simple delivery, but he brushed off my questions. He called it a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, something too big to pass up. At first, I said no. I didn't want the stress or the long hours again. But he kept pushing, reminding me of the money and how easy it would be. Against my better judgment, I gave in. I told myself it was just 2 trips, no big deal. But part of me couldn't stop wondering, what kind of job was worth that much money? 2 days later, I found myself standing at a facility in Detroit. In front of me was a massive truck already loaded and ready to go. The trailer looked spotless, almost too clean for something that had been on the road before. Next to me was my partner for the job, a guy in his 30s who seemed sharp and all business. We introduced ourselves quickly, but there wasn't much time for small talk. Before we left, my old manager pulled me aside to go over the rules. The first one was simple but strange. Under no circumstances were we allowed to open the trailer. He emphasized this so strongly that it immediately made me uneasy. Then he explained the second rule. 2 escort cars would follow us the entire trip, 1 in front and 1 behind. Finally, we had to hand over our phones to a security team. I asked why, but all he said was, "The client doesn't want distractions." His answers didn't sit right with me, but the promise of $500,000 was enough to push my doubts aside. I handed over my phone, climbed into the truck, and started the engine. For the first few hours, the drive was uneventful. I kept the radio on to stay alert, letting the sound fill the silence. My partner sat quietly, staring out the window or checking the map every now and then. But as the night went on, I began to hear something. It was faint at first, like a soft knock coming from the trailer. At first I thought it was just the cargo shifting, but the sound didn't go away. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it sent chills through me. Whatever was back there, it wasn't just cargo. As the faint knocking continued, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my chest. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like someone or something was deliberately making the noise. When we stopped to switch drivers, I decided to mention it to my partner. He looked at me, his face serious, and nodded. "Yeah, I heard it too," he said. "But it's probably nothing. Weird sounds aren't unusual out here." His words didn't comfort me. Something about the way he brushed it off felt forced, like he didn't want to think about it too much. I let it go for the moment, grabbed a quick meal, and climbed into the back of the cab to try and sleep. But even with my eyes closed, the sound lingered in my mind, tapping away like it was trying to tell me something. When we finally reached our destination, the sun was just starting to rise. The mansion in front of us was massive, with towering gates and perfectly trimmed lawns stretching as far as the eye could see. It was the kind of place you only see in magazines or on TV. As we pulled in, security guards swarmed the truck, moving with precision and urgency. They told us to get out and wait outside while they took the truck into the loading dock. The morning air was heavy and the silence was unsettling. My mind raced with questions. What was in that trailer? Why all the secrecy? Curiosity got the better of me. I told one of the guards I needed to use the bathroom. At first he refused, but after a bit of pleading, he finally agreed. He led me inside, but I had no idea the answers I was about to uncover would leave me shaken. The guard led me through the grand entrance of the mansion. The place was enormous and luxurious, but something about it felt cold and unwelcoming. The floors gleamed, the walls were covered in expensive artwork, yet it felt more like a museum than a home. He showed me to the bathroom and waited outside. As soon as I stepped in, I noticed a small window tucked away in the corner. It wasn't easy to spot, but once I saw it, I couldn't look away. Through the window, I could see two guards carrying a large container. It was heavy enough that they struggled to move it, and it had a lock on the front. Then I heard it again, the banging. It was louder this time, almost desperate. My stomach dropped as I started to connect the dots. That sound, the container, the secrecy, it didn't feel right. I didn't know what was inside, but I couldn't shake the thought that it might not be just cargo. As I glanced around the bathroom, I noticed a camera mounted high on the wall. It was small, almost hidden, but it was pointed directly at me. My unease grew as I realized this wasn't a normal job. When I confronted the guard about the camera, he laughed it off. "Don't worry, it doesn't work," he said casually. But his words didn't ease my mind. If anything, they made me feel worse. What kind of place needed cameras everywhere, even in the bathroom? When I returned outside, my partner was waiting by the truck. I told him what I'd seen: the locked container, the banging, and the camera in the bathroom. His face went pale, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Before we could talk any further, the truck was brought back to us and the guards handed over envelopes containing our payment. Each envelope held $500,000. The money felt unreal in my hands, like something out of a dream or a nightmare. For a brief moment, it dulled the unease I'd been feeling, but not for long. The second part of the job sounded simple: pick up another truck at a nearby facility, bring it back to the mansion, and collect the rest of the payment. It should have been straightforward, but something about the first trip stuck with me. The strange rules, the muffled sounds, and the guarded secrecy made me question what I had gotten myself into. The drive to the facility was silent. My partner, who had been talkative earlier, now stared ahead, gripping the armrest tightly. Even the escort cars felt different this time. Their dark windows and precise movements no longer seemed reassuring. They felt like a warning. When we arrived, the second truck was already waiting for us. It looked identical to the first, clean, loaded, and ready to go. The guards handed over the keys without saying a word, their faces blank. As I climbed into the cab, the unease from before hit me even harder. As we started the engine and rolled onto the highway, the familiar sound of banging began again. Only this time, it was louder, frantic, almost as if whatever was inside knew we were moving again. The banging from the trailer grew louder as we drove. It wasn't just random noise anymore, it sounded desperate, almost alive. My hands gripped the wheel tighter as my mind raced. What were we transporting? I glanced at my partner, but he avoided eye contact, his jaw clenched. "We can't keep ignoring this," I said, my voice low. "Something's not right." He shook his head without looking at me. "We don't ask questions. That's the deal. You want to dig into this? Go ahead, but I'm not risking my life." His words hit hard. Part of me wanted to argue, to demand answers, but another part of me knew he was right. Whoever was behind this operation wasn't someone we could cross. I stayed quiet, but the unease in my chest grew with every mile. The escort cars stayed close, their presence more oppressive than comforting. Occasionally, the one behind us flashed its headlights, almost as if to remind us they were watching. When we finally arrived back at the mansion, the sun was beginning to set. The long shadows of the estate stretched across the driveway, making the place look even more intimidating. The guards were already waiting. They moved quickly, taking the truck without a word. I watched as they unloaded it, their actions sharp and robotic. Whatever was inside, they treated it with a strange mix of urgency and fear. My partner stood silently beside me, his face pale, as if he already knew this wasn't just a normal delivery. When the guards handed us the second payment, another $500,000, I should have felt relieved. But holding that envelope only made my stomach churn. The money was real, but so was the weight of what we had done. My partner clutched his envelope tightly, his face blank, but his hands were trembling. "We're done, right?" I asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. "Yeah," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're done." We climbed into the now empty truck, ready to drive it back to the facility in Detroit. As we pulled out of the mansion, something felt different. The escort cars that had followed us during the first trips were gone. At first, I thought this would make the drive feel easier, less tense, but the silence that filled the cab was worse. Without the constant presence of the black vehicles, the road felt empty and exposed. My partner sat stiffly, his eyes locked on the highway. I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was. Every bump in the road, every shadow in the mirror made my heart race. The truck was empty now, but my mind wasn't. Whatever had been in that trailer, it wasn't something I could just forget. That night I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the envelope of money. It should have felt like a victory, but instead it felt like a weight pressing on my chest. The questions wouldn't stop swirling in my head. What was in those containers? Why all the secrecy? And what had I just been a part of? I opened my laptop, desperate for answers. I typed in everything. I felt stuck, and there were no clear answers, no names, no proof. It was like hitting a wall I couldn't climb. But one thing was clear. Whatever this was, someone had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden. I turned off my laptop and sat in silence. The truth was out there, but finding it felt impossible. Yet deep down, I knew I couldn't just forget about it. Some doors once opened can't be closed, and I had walked through one that would haunt me forever.